The horrifying discovery by the lake. It was just another quiet morning in late July in the small town of Fairhaven, Missouri, a place where strangers waved at each other in passing and the hum of cicadas was more frequent than the sound of car engines. Ray Johnson, a retired mechanic in his late 60s, had a simple morning ritual: grab his fishing rod, head to Willow Creek Lake, and cast a line in the hopes of snagging a sizable bass before breakfast. The lake wasn't much. A quiet, shallow body of water used mostly by locals for cooling off during the brutal Missouri summers. Ray didn't expect much more than some peace and quiet. That particular morning, as the hazy sunlight broke through a dense mist over the lake, Ray found his spot near an old rickety dock. He set his gear down, opened his worn tackle box, and hummed to himself while tying a lure. Casting his line into the still, glassy water, he sat down on an overturned bucket, content with the predictability of the day. But 10 minutes in, as his line floated idly on the surface, something unusual grabbed his attention. He spotted what looked like an old plastic bag drifting slowly along the current. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than discarded trash, a sad but common sight in recent years. Grumbling about how inconsiderate people could be, Ray reeled in his line, set aside his rod, and reached for his net to fish the bag out. A man who loved this little lake, he couldn't stand letting anyone pollute it, even in small ways. As the bag drifted closer to shore, Ray noticed something odd. The plastic wasn't just floating aimlessly, it seemed weighted, like it contained something heavy. He reached out with the long pole of his net, snagged the edge of the bag, and pulled it toward him. The bag tore as he dragged it up onto the shore, spilling out a waterlogged bundle of God knows what onto the soft mud. "What the hell is this?" Ray muttered under his breath, crouching down to inspect the contents. At first glance it seemed like scraps of bone mixed with what could have been chunks of rotting meat. But as Ray leaned in closer, he felt his stomach clench. One piece of bone stood out, a long, pale fragment with a curved shape and a rounded knob at one end. It looked eerily familiar, like something he'd seen years ago in an anatomy book back in high school. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a human femur. Ray stumbled back, nearly tripping over the exposed roots of a tree behind him. His hands were trembling, his breath ragged. He kept staring at the bone as though it might spring to life, willing himself to believe it wasn't real. It can't be. Maybe it's from a deer, maybe it's from a pig. But deep down he knew better. This wasn't roadkill, this was human. No longer thinking about fish or his morning coffee, Ray pulled a tattered handkerchief from his pocket, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and fumbled for his cell phone. His fingers shook so badly that he dropped it once before managing to call 911. His voice cracked as he told the operator what he'd found. He was told to stay put and wait for authorities. By the time the first police cruiser arrived 20 minutes later, Ray had cleared out of the immediate area, pacing anxiously near his truck parked along the gravel shoulder of the dirt road. A young deputy, probably not much older than 25, stepped out of the car with a clipboard in hand. He had that air of routine call indifference, but that shifted quickly when Ray led him to the lake's edge and gestured toward the grotesque bundle. The deputy froze, his jaw tightening as the other officer accompanying him called in for backup. Within an hour, the quiet lake was a hive of activity. Yellow police tape was strung between the trees, and crime scene investigators in gloves and boot covers waded cautiously into the shallow water near where the bag had been found. Forensic technicians were documenting the scene with cameras and carefully collecting every fragment of the grisly find. Meanwhile, the small crowd of curious townsfolk that gathered along the lake road began buzzing with speculation. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Did they really find something?" one woman in a floral sun hat asked. "I heard it was a murder victim," someone replied. Nobody had any real details, but that didn't stop the rumors. Ray tried to keep to himself, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with his head in his hands, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The local news station caught wind of the story by midday. A reporter and cameraman arrived, their presence sparking more intrigue as they set up near the police perimeter. By the evening, nearly half the town had heard about Ray Johnson's horrifying discovery by the lake. It wasn't long before speculation snowballed into wild theories. A gang dumping bodies, a serial killer passing through town, or perhaps something even darker no one wanted to say aloud. The Quiet Town and Collins Burger Joint. Nestled in the rolling countryside of Missouri, Fairhaven had always been the kind of place where life moved at an unhurried, comforting pace. With a population of just over 3,000, the town was a slice of Americana, a pocket of life far removed from the noise and bustle of the modern urban world. Its streets were lined with mom-and-pop shops, churches with whitewashed steeples, and houses that had stood for generations. On most evenings you could hear the sound of kids riding bikes, dogs barking in backyards, or the faint melody of a high school marching band practice drifting in from the football field on the hill. The residents of Fairhaven took pride in their little town. It was a place where everyone knew each other, enough to casually wave when passing on the street, but not so much that you'd know every little skeleton in every closet. That was the charm of Fairhaven. The town's most vibrant hub was Main Street, where you'd find everything from the old-school drugstore with its shiny red vinyl bar stools, to the ice cream parlor that still sold cones for $1 on summer weekends. And then there was Collins's Diner, a cornerstone of the Fairhaven experience. It wasn't flashy or fancy, just a modest burger joint on the corner of Maple and 2nd Avenue. The restaurant had its share of quirks, though. Its neon sign proclaiming Collins Diner best burgers in town flickered and buzzed in a way that somehow added to its charm. On most weekends you could hear the creak of its screen door as customers came and went, raving about the buttery buns, perfectly grilled patties, and generous side of fries. The diner had been around for nearly 8 years, quietly run by Jack Collins. Jack wasn't a Fairhaven native. He'd drifted into town one summer from somewhere up north, or maybe it was out west, depending on which story you chose to believe. He wasn't one for sharing much about his past. Still, Jack fit into Fairhaven in his own, quiet, unassuming way. He was the kind of guy who never missed a day of work, always remembered your order by the 3rd visit, and kept to himself when it came to anything unrelated to burgers or fries. Jack lived in one of the small apartments above the diner, just him, a cat named Elvis, and an unwavering routine. Every morning Jack could be found unlocking the door to the diner promptly at 6 a.m., the smell of sizzling bacon greeting the early birds of Fairhaven. And every night, long after the rest of the town had settled down under the glow of porch lights and starry skies, the soft hum of his kitchen fan and the orange glow in the diner's back window hinted that Jack still hadn't finished his day. People liked Jack. He wasn't the friendliest guy, sure, but he had this way about him that made folks trust him. He was as much a part of the town as the diner itself. "He's just quiet, you know," locals said of him when asked. "Keeps his head down, does his work." That's why it wasn't strange that no one ever pried too much into Jack's personal life. There wasn't much to pry into anyway, or so it seemed. Collins's Diner thrived under Jack's management. Truckers passing through on cross-state routes would park just off Main Street to grab a famous burger, and farmers coming back from town meetings knew Jack always had a pot of coffee ready. Then there were the regulars, the kind of customers who practically had their own booths. Evelyn, the retired schoolteacher, came every Wednesday for her burger, extra pickles, no cheese. Deputy Lambert always grabbed lunch on Tuesday afternoons, his badge and holster taking up half the table. And don't forget Randy, who came in every Friday night, still in his baseball uniform after coaching the middle school team. But for all the charm Collins's Diner brought, there were always little mysteries about the place. Small, harmless oddities that you dismiss as quirks if you ever noticed them at all. Other local restaurants ordered their beef from the same supplier over in Jefferson City, but Jack never seemed to. He spoke vaguely about a different, more affordable source that saved him the trip. New staff rarely lasted long in the diner either. For every waitress or dishwasher hired, it seemed they'd leave quietly within weeks. When asked, they either shrugged it off or muttered something about not being able to handle odd hours. Still, Fairhaven wasn't the kind of place to dwell on small details. As long as the burgers stayed good, the coffee stayed hot, and Jack was polite enough behind the counter, nobody wanted to make waves. Sure, some of the town's gossips like Martha Jenkins, who never met a rumor she didn't like, speculated about Jack from time to time. "You know, I've heard he used to be married," she once whispered at the hair salon. "But something tragic happened." Others would chime in, "I bet he's hiding from something. Nobody moves to a town this small without a reason." But none of that ever stuck. Jack was, for lack of a better term, normal. And in a town like Fairhaven, normal didn't need to be questioned. That's why, when something big or strange did happen, no one ever thought to associate it with Jack or his diner. He was too ordinary, too steady. A man who flipped burgers and minded his business. No one could have imagined the nightmares that would unravel, not from the man who took such care with his recipes, who always greeted his customers with a nod, and who kept his chin tucked just low enough to avoid attracting attention. The strange bag and the first signs. The morning the bag was discovered at Willow Creek Lake seemed to have no reason to stand out. It was one of those quiet summer days that seeped into the bones of Fairhaven. The kind of day where the cicadas buzzing mixed with the warm rhythm of life in town, and nobody expected anything extraordinary to happen. But as Ray Johnson stood beside his truck after pulling that torn bag out of the lake, the town's perpetual calm began to fray. Something about the bag and what spilled out, a haunting mix of discolored bones and decaying tissue, set off silent alarms in his gut. Ray wasn't the only one unnerved. Within a few hours, word had spread across Fairhaven like wildfire, turning what should have been a simple day of errands and leisure into a buzz of unease. Once the police arrived, it didn't take long for them to realize this wasn't a routine cleanup of tossed garbage. The remains in the bag were immediately carted off to a lab in Jefferson City, the nearest city with forensic capabilities, for proper examination. Preliminary guesses suggested that the bag contained human bones. This simple fact sent shivers down the spines of not just the investigating officers, but the entire Fairhaven community. People began whispering in worried tones at the grocery store and gas station. A mystery this big was unheard of in town, a real puzzle that no one knew how to make sense of yet, and beyond gossip lay the question no one dared to voice: who did the bones belong to? Officer Brent Willows, a young deputy barely out of the academy, found himself pacing near the scene of the discovery. He lacked experience with hardened crime, and like most officers in Fairhaven, the worst he'd ever dealt with involved teenage mischief or the occasional bar fight. But this was different. "I've never seen something like this," he muttered to Deputy Lambert, who had been in the game a little longer. Lambert nodded solemnly before suggesting, "Just do the basics. Secure the area. Nobody touches anything until we know what we're dealing with." Over at City Hall, the town mayor, Jim Hartford, appeared shaken during an impromptu gathering of city officials. "We've got to handle this carefully," he told the room, his usual confident tone replaced with tension. That tension carried over to Sheriff Diana Kane's office. She knew one find like this would pull at every loose thread in town, potentially exposing the secrets buried deep in Fairhaven's past or present. But in small towns, secrets never stayed hidden for long. While forensic experts in Jefferson City worked on the bones, the broader question of how the bag got into Willow Creek Lake loomed large. Floods of theories poured into the sheriff's office. Some were mundane, like, "It's gotta be roadkill someone put in the wrong bag." But some theories were darker. A few locals wondered aloud if the bones came from an old, unsolved disappearance. Others quickly bypassed rational logic altogether and started muttering something about a serial killer. "I don't like this," murmured Evelyn Saunders, the town's only hairdresser, as she snipped her client's hair that afternoon. "This isn't the kind of thing that belongs here. Stuff like this happens in big cities, not in places like Fairhaven." Evelyn was normally a source of gossip and light chatter for her customers, but her words this morning carried a weight no one could shake off. Meanwhile, at a corner booth in Collins's diner, the conversation swirled hot and heavy. Jack Collins, as he wiped down the counter for the umpteenth time, couldn't help overhearing the table of retirees who gathered each morning for coffee and bacon sandwiches. They chatted about everything: theories, fears, and the vague sense of dread now hanging over the town like an unwelcome guest. "You hear about that bag at the lake?" one of them asked. "It's gotta be a prank or something." "Prank my foot," another retorted. "I hear it's real freaking bones in there." "Human bones?" "That's the rumor anyway," the first man murmured, lowering his voice like the bones themselves might overhear. Jack kept wiping the counter and said nothing, his face neutral as it always was when conversation strayed into territory he didn't feel like joining. For Sheriff Kane, the case shouldn't have been anything more than a routine discovery for the forensics team, but something about it didn't sit well. That gut feeling was hard to describe. Maybe it was the moisture-clogged bag itself, or the fact that no one had come forward with a logical explanation yet. "It could be nothing," she told her deputy, shutting her office door behind them. "Or it could be, well, God knows what, and I'm not liking the second option." As the weekend rolled around, the bag and its contents were confirmed by the forensics team to contain human remains. Bones belonging to an adult male estimated to be in his mid to late 30s. The analysis suggested the remains hadn't been in the lake for very long, maybe a few weeks at most. However, the bag itself, stained and smelling faintly of chemicals, indicated an almost deliberate attempt to conceal the remains before being discarded. This news didn't just trickle into town, it rang like a church bell at midnight, striking every home's sense of safety. "You think someone dumped it there purposefully?" asked Howard Biggs, owner of the hardware store, to a customer picking up insect repellent. "That's exactly what it sounds like, but why here of all places?" That was the pivotal question that began gnawing at the town. Fairhaven wasn't the kind of place for calculated malice, so who could have done this? And more importantly, where did the rest of the body go? Back at Willow Creek Lake, a peaceful, glittering slice of nature that now played host to yellow police tape and watchful deputies. Dog walkers, joggers, and picnickers avoided the area. The laughter of children splashing in shallow waters and the smell of barbecue charcoal were noticeably absent that weekend. Where Fun Creek BBQs used to happen, now stood silence and stares. In the eerie quiet, a renewed horror surfaced. Perhaps this town wasn't as simple as everyone liked to believe. Layers of fear, speculation, and intrigue began to spread across Fairhaven like ripples in water. And in the midst of it all, Jack Collins at the diner kept his routines, kept flipping burgers and smiling that faint smile of his, as if the chaos outside wouldn't dare touch the world he had built inside his little corner of Maple and Second. The missing victims, and their silent mysteries. In the months leading up to the grim discovery at Willow Creek Lake, the quiet streets of Fairhaven had already begun whispering about disappearances. Like most small towns, Fairhaven was the sort of place where everyone noticed if someone missed church service too many Sundays in a row, or skipped their turn at the town Rotary meeting. So when a few familiar faces quietly slipped out of sight, people started to talk. The first name that came up was James Riker, the easygoing young man who worked as a delivery driver for Henderson's Wholesale Meats. His job took him across several counties, from diners to grocery stores, and even to local eateries like Collins Diner, where his truck was a familiar sight parked out front every Tuesday morning. At just 24 years old, James was what locals called a good kid. He'd grown up in Fairhaven, helped his dad fix cars during the summers, and had a reputation for being polite and reliable. James would never just up and leave, his mother had told Sheriff Kane when she filed a missing persons report back in June. He said he had a delivery route up Country 47 that day, but he never came home. His truck was found by the side of the road, but he wasn't in it. His cell phone, his keys, it was all still there. The investigation into James's disappearance hit a dead end almost immediately. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, just an empty truck and a growing pit of dread in the stomachs of those closest to him. Sheriff Kane, who had dealt with her fair share of runaways and fake calls for attention, couldn't shake the feeling that James's case was different. And then there was Amy Greer. At 17, Amy had been working part-time as a waitress at Collins's Diner during the summer to save money for college. She was the kind of girl who lit up a room when she walked in, outgoing, talkative, and always quick to flash a disarming smile. Her disappearance in early July unnerved the town in a way that James's had not. Maybe it was her age, maybe it was how eerily sudden it seemed. According to her parents, Amy had clocked in for her evening shift at the diner but never made it home afterward. When her mother called Collins's Diner the next morning, Jack Collins himself answered the phone. His deep, monotone voice offered a curt explanation. She finished her shift like usual and said she had somewhere to be. Maybe she met up with her friends. But she hadn't met up with anyone. Her car was still in the diner's gravel parking lot, keys tucked under the driver's seat like she always left them. Her bag was still inside too. It didn't take long for rumors to ripple throughout the community. "She wouldn't just take off like that," Susan Greer told the sheriff during her tearful statement. "She was responsible. She kept her phone on her all the time so I could check in, and now there's nothing. Nothing!" Sheriff Kane and her deputies interviewed co-workers, friends, and anyone else who might have seen Amy that evening. One of the busboys who worked during the same shift claimed that Amy had seemed distracted that night, like she had something pressing on her mind. But no one could explain how or why she vanished, not a single trace left behind aside from her car in the parking lot. And then there were other disappearances, ones smaller in scale, the kind that didn't garner much attention in the beginning. A couple of transient workers had last been seen passing through town. There was Earl Jenkins, a retired trucker who lived just outside Fairhaven in a trailer and suddenly stopped showing up at the bar where he played pool nightly. Gwen West, a craftswoman who sold handmade candles at the farmer's market, also stopped attending the Sunday market booth she always set up. At first, people chalked these disappearances up to mundane explanations. Maybe they'd moved away or gotten tired of small-town life. But as the months dragged on and no word came from them, unease began to settle over Fairhaven. Yet, there was one common thread tying many of these cases together: Collins's diner. Several of the missing had last been seen there, either grabbing a bite to eat, passing through for work, or, like Amy, employed directly under Jack Collins himself. Despite concerns quietly growing among the townsfolk, Jack seemed unfazed. He continued flipping burgers and talking to customers as if nothing had changed. His demeanor was steady, calm, and professional. If he knew anything about the disappearances, he wasn't showing it. While the sheriff's office filed each missing person's report into its database and ran background checks, no immediate links beyond circumstantial evidence were found. The diner wasn't a crime scene, and there was nothing overtly suspicious about Jack or his business. Even the investigators who had initially questioned Jack described him as cooperative, if a little aloof. But cracks began to show. Elaine Rooker, a regular customer, mentioned to her neighbor over coffee one day that she had seen something odd a few nights before Amy disappeared. Passing by the diner late one night, she recalled seeing Jack dragging a heavy bag from the kitchen out back towards his truck. "I didn't think much of it at the time," she admitted. "Figured it was just trash or something. But now..." Her voice trailed off. In hindsight, people started to recall all kinds of strange things they hadn't paid attention to but, in light of recent events, now seemed unsettlingly out of place. The sounds of banging and clanging from the diner's kitchen late at night. The way Jack always insisted on unloading deliveries himself, even snapping at younger employees who offered to help. The fact that every few weeks the diner would be closed for deep cleaning. Yet no one ever seemed to see cleaning crews going in. It was also becoming apparent that the diner's meat supplier had shifted. Jack had started buying less and less from the local butchers in town. Said he had a cheaper source, one butcher brought up during questioning, though he couldn't recall details about who or where Jack was now sourcing from. All of these details created a murky picture, one where suspicion hovered just out of reach, never solidifying into anything concrete. But when the bag of bones appeared on the shore of Willow Creek Lake, something shifted. For the first time, a tangible piece of evidence seemed to link the missing persons to a larger, far more sinister story brewing beneath the surface of Fairhaven's idyllic charm. The strange signs inside Collins' kitchen. To most folks in Fairhaven, Collins' Diner was nothing more than a place to grab a good burger and catch up on local gossip. Its small kitchen, wedged behind the front counter, was a mystery to outsiders, a space built for efficiency, not spectacle. Most locals imagined it as they did any kitchen: a grill sizzling with patties, a fryer bubbling with golden fries, and shelves stocked with ingredients for the diner's daily routine. But that image couldn't have been further from the truth. When Sheriff Kane and her team requested their first walkthrough of Collins's kitchen, it didn't initially raise any red flags. Jack Collins himself had agreed, though with a gruff reluctance. He unlocked the back door while insisting, "Nothing out of the ordinary here, just a kitchen like any other." But as the deputies entered, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a sense that not everything was as it seemed. The first thing they noticed was the large walk-in freezer occupying one corner of the kitchen. Its steel door gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a heavy-duty padlock hung conspicuously on the handle. When questioned about the lock, Jack shrugged and muttered, "Just standard practice. Keeps everything organized and secure." Yet, the cold air seeping from the edges of the door carried a faint, unpleasant odor, one that didn't match the clean scent of frozen food. It smelled sour, like something had lived and died within its steel confines. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Deputy Lambert asked, trying to keep it casual. Jack's response was immediate and sharp. "No need for that," he said, crossing his arms tightly. "Just frozen patties and some prep ingredients. Nothing to see." It wasn't an outright refusal, but the defensive tone set the deputies on edge. The padlocked freezer wasn't the only unusual thing about the kitchen. As the officers walked through the space, they noticed signs of wear and tear that didn't quite add up to the diner's reputation for cleanliness. The tiles near the back door were cracked and stained, a subtle but persistent discoloration that looked suspiciously like old blood. Scrapes and grooves marked the metal counters, deep enough that they didn't seem accidental. And then, there was the equipment. The diner's grill was enormous, much larger than what was necessary for a small-town joint like Collins's Diner. Sheriff Kane made a mental note as she scanned the room. Why would someone need such a heavy-duty setup for a place that only served burgers and fries? When questioned about the stains on the floor, Jack waved it off. "Spilled some beef juices the other day," he said dismissively, his eyes darting to the freezer and back. "You know how it is in a kitchen, gets messy. I clean up as best I can, but it's hard to keep things spotless when you're short-handed." His words might have been convincing if they weren't paired with the lingering odor. It grew worse as the deputies moved toward the back of the kitchen, where several large garbage bags sat tied and propped against the wall. One seemed to sag under its weight, and a faint trail of fluid had dried beneath its base. "Those the morning trash?" Deputy Willows asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jack hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Yeah, planning to take those out after the rush," he mumbled. The deputies exchanged glances, their eyes landing briefly on the nearest garbage bag. Kane wanted to push the conversation further, but she also knew she needed a search warrant to dig deeper. For now, they'd noted the details, but the tension in the air only grew as Jack's gaze hardened under their scrutiny. It wasn't just the physical things that felt wrong either. As they spoke with Jack, a sense of something darker began to creep in, an intuition that often accompanied years of law enforcement. The way he avoided direct eye contact when they got too close to the freezer, the way his answers spun the same vague story over and over, and the fact that every time they asked about his meat suppliers, his responses shifted, subtly, but noticeably. First it was a local farm just outside of town. Later it became a buddy with a ranch upstate, and then eventually, simply, "Don't worry about it." Later that evening, as the team debriefed back at the sheriff's office, Deputy Lambert voiced what everyone was already thinking. "He's hiding something. That freezer, the smell, it's not just spoiled food, it felt wrong." Kane nodded. "Yeah, but we can't act on gut feelings. Not yet. We'll need to get a warrant before we can lay a finger on that lock." Back in town, stories about Jack's kitchen began circulating among the diner's former employees. Once word got out that the sheriff had stopped by, some of those who had worked long shifts under Jack Collins reluctantly shared their own suspicions. One waitress admitted she'd noticed strange noises coming from the back after hours, metal screeches and dull thuds, like someone dragging heavy furniture across the floor. A former busboy remembered being scolded harshly when he lingered near the freezer, even though all he'd been doing was storing a box of napkins. Another ex-employee told the sheriff's office that food delivery schedules at the diner had become erratic in the last year. "We used to get meat deliveries every other week from Henderson's. Then, suddenly we stopped seeing the truck. Jack said he'd found a cheaper supplier, but nobody ever came to drop anything off. I always figured he picked it up somewhere himself, but now—" Her voice trailed off, heavy with unease. The most unusual anecdote came from a dishwasher who had worked at Collins's diner for just 3 weeks. He claimed to have seen Jack late one night, long after the diner had closed, dragging a large black bag across the kitchen floor. "It was leaking something," he said, visibly pale as he recalled the image. "When I asked if he needed help taking it to the dumpster, he snapped at me, said I should mind my own damn business. I quit a week later." All of it painted the same hazy picture. A man running a seemingly normal establishment, but harboring secrets just beneath the surface. Whatever was inside the padlocked freezer, it wasn't just ground beef. And whatever Jack Collins was hiding, it was only a matter of time before the cracks grew too big to conceal. The chilling rumors around town. Rumors have a way of breathing life into small towns, especially a place like Fairhaven, Missouri. Fairhaven didn't just thrive on gossip, it thrummed with it, like an undercurrent beneath the polite smiles and friendly waves. It was harmless most of the time. People whispered about who might have gotten a little too tipsy at the last county fair, or which teenager had been caught sneaking out past curfew. But the discovery at Willow Creek Lake had shifted the game entirely. It lit a match in a room already full of dry kindling, and the flames of fear and speculation spread fast. At first, the townsfolk tried to act like everything was normal. People still went about their routines, grabbing groceries at Biggs's Hardware and Market, stopping by Collins's diner for a coffee, and chatting on their front porches as the sun sank low over the horizon. But behind every passing nod or casual "how you doin'" lay hushed bewilderment and unease. They were all asking themselves the same question: what the hell was that bag doing in our lake? It didn't take long before the whispers started forming theories. At the church potluck on Saturday night, Pastor Gilmore heard his congregation asking questions that didn't have easy answers. "I heard it's gang business," one man muttered, leaning over a pew as if he were trading intelligence for the FBI. "You know, small towns like ours, they think we're easy pickings for dumping evidence. Betcha some outfit from St. Louis came through here and left that mess behind." Others weren't so sure. "Gang business nonsense!" Nancy Draper, who ran the local florist shop, scoffed over a plate of chicken casserole. "This isn't big city stuff. Somebody here knows something. You can't tell me this happens out of nowhere." Someone else nearby muttered, "It feels personal, like whoever dumped that bag, they didn't just happen on Fairhaven for no reason. They chose it." By Monday morning, more voices had joined the chorus of speculation. At Evelyn Saunders' beauty salon, the chatter was relentless. Evelyn, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper scissors, had always been Fairhaven's unofficial news anchor. "I've had 3 clients already this morning bring up Jack Collins," she confided to her assistant during a brief lull. "They said he's acting odd. You've noticed it too, haven't you?" Her assistant glanced nervously toward the window and avoided answering. Collins's diner, usually the heart of cheerful drawl and laughter, became an uncanny place. Regular customers started looking over their shoulders, lingering just a little longer by the front door before walking in. Jack Collins himself, stoic and quiet as always, went about his business like nothing was wrong. But was it really, though? The rumors about Jack didn't take long to boil to the surface. Evelyn, fueled by her customers' stories, had painted him as a man with something to hide. "He doesn't get his beef from Henderson's anymore, you know," she told anyone who sat still long enough to hear it. "Nobody knows where he gets it from, but the local butchers don't deliver to him anymore. He says it's cheaper, but what does that even mean?" At the same time, Martha Jenkins, notorious for creating conspiracies out of shared glances, took it a step further during her breakfast with friends at the diner. "You think he has an underground room or something?" she hissed, gripping her coffee cup tightly as if preparing for it to spill. "I'm not saying he's a killer, but come on, the diner's always got that faint smell, like weird meat, you know? What if," her voice dropped low, "he knows more about those bones in that lake than he's letting on?" The truth didn't matter to folks like Martha. Once someone planted a seed, it quickly grew into something bigger. From Collins's strange freezer habits to employees recalling late-night cleaning noises, everything suddenly felt suspect when viewed under the cold light of hindsight. A former busboy even added kindling to the fire by sharing his own uneasy memory at the local library to a group of sympathetic listeners. "I'll be honest," he murmured, not meeting anyone's eyes. "I don't want to say anything bad about Jack, but I knew something was wrong the second he told me not to mess with the freezer. He didn't even want me stacking things near it." Beyond Jack, other rumors spiraled further away from the plausible. Teenagers in search of thrills and drama had begun spreading stories among themselves about a serial killer loose in Fairhaven. "I bet it's that guy who camps out by Cold Hollow Road," one junior at the high school said at lunch. "You know, the guy always wearing that ratty blue jacket? My dad said he's just passing through, but what if he's not? What if he's passing through bodies?" The idea that someone familiar might be living a double life wasn't entirely alien to a small town, and nothing got teenagers riled up faster than mystery paired with danger. Fairhaven's mayor, Jim Hartford, tried his best to tamp down the flames of the escalating chatter. "We can't go pointing fingers at folks without real evidence," he announced during a town meeting, gripping his lectern a little harder than his usual easygoing demeanor would suggest. "This is an investigation. Sheriff Kane and her deputies are handling it. Let's not make this a witch hunt." But no amount of reassurances could stop what was already spreading like poison through the town's veins. The pervasive unease settled over everyone like smoke that wouldn't clear, clouding their views of neighbors, friends, and even themselves. By the end of the first week after the discovery, the air in Fairhaven felt heavier. The town, once bright and open, now seemed darkened by what the people didn't understand. At Collins' diner, business slowed down drastically. Patrons no longer filled the booths with the same enthusiasm. Conversations were short, nervous. Jack, for all his quiet resilience, didn't seem to flinch when even rumors of his secret suppliers had fueled the bonfire of accusations. He flipped burgers, poured coffee, and swept his floors with a kind of eerie calm, as if he knew that talking back would only add fuel to the already raging fire. But that calm, which had always been Jack's trademark, now only added to people's distrust. They wanted him to snap, to be rattled under suspicion, but he didn't. And in a town ruled by whispers, that kind of calm wasn't comforting, it was unsettling. The horrifying discovery, a series of shocking evidence. It wasn't until Sheriff Diana Kane secured a search warrant for Collins's diner that the true horror of Fairhaven began to unravel. The warrant had been a long time coming, fueled by mounting suspicions, strange stories from former employees, and those eerie rumors that refused to let the sheriff's department rest. Everyone in the small sheriff's office knew that walking back into that diner meant they might discover something horrifying, but no one could have prepared for what they would find. The search started early on a Friday morning. Jack Collins, as stoic as ever, leaned against the diner's counter as officers filed into his kitchen, their faces grim and purposeful. "You won't find anything interesting," Jack grumbled, his voice as calm as it had ever been. His unbothered demeanor seemed to only heighten the unease already lingering in the air. The investigators began their work meticulously, photographing every corner of the diner, examining every surface for clues. At first the kitchen seemed ordinary, though unsettlingly clean in some places and suspiciously unkempt in others. The greasy grill, still littered with faint streaks of last night's cooking, smelled like old bacon. Cupboards contained rows of standard diner supplies, ketchup bottles, salt shakers, canned goods. For a moment the deputies began to think the rumors about Jack Collins would lead to nothing more than a wild goose chase. But it was the freezer, gleaming, locked and emitting that faint, sour odor that drew everyone's attention like a magnet. When the deputies finally forced the padlock open, the heavy steel door swung wide with an unsettling groan, releasing a rush of icy air and a stench that made even the toughest officers gag. Inside the walk-in freezer were several large black garbage bags, neatly stacked and sealed tightly. For a moment the room was filled with only the eerie hum of the freezer motor and the nervous shuffling of boots. Sheriff Kane was the first to step forward. Donning gloves, she crouched beside the nearest bag and carefully worked it open. What spilled out of the bag wasn't old hamburger patties or packages of frozen fries. Instead, the officers found what initially appeared to be chunks of raw meat, dark, unidentifiable flesh mixed with jagged pieces of bone. But as the team hovered closer, it became horrifyingly clear that these weren't the remains of cows or pigs or anything else you'd expect to find in a diner freezer. "Is that—" Deputy Lambert's voice cracked as his words trailed off, his face turning pale as realization washed over him. The bones they uncovered were human, jagged, sawed-down remains that had been meticulously cut apart, likely to make them less identifiable. Another bag revealed the same ghastly contents, rotting chunks of flesh and bone, some still clinging to scraps of clothing or personal effects, worn buttons, a faded fabric scrap, a dented keychain. These were no old supplies forgotten in storage. These were people. The discovery prompted the arrival of forensic experts who immediately began cataloging every item found inside the freezer. Further examination revealed the remains belonged to multiple individuals. At least 3 distinct DNA profiles were identified in the initial analysis. Towels, soaked in dried blood, were also tucked behind the freezer shelves, hastily shoved out of sight. And the horrors didn't stop there. The officers turned their attention to the kitchen itself, now seeing the formerly mundane appliances in an entirely different light. The massive industrial grill, which Jack had often boasted could handle any rush Fairhaven threw at him, was not just a tool for flipping burgers. Forensic swabs picked up traces of human DNA baked into the crevices of its greasy surface. Blood splatters, faint but present, dotted deeper corners of the kitchen tile, pooling near the baseboards and seeping under the heavy mounting of equipment. Jack's explanation that these stains were simply from messy beef prep didn't hold water anymore. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came as investigators uncovered the tools stored neatly in a side compartment next to the freezer. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary kitchen knives and butcher's cleavers, perfectly fitting in a place where meat preparation was part of the daily grind. But the blades were sharper than anything needed for diner fare, and many bore deep scratches and filings consistent with being used on tougher material than beef or pork. A hidden compartment nearby contained a series of saws, bone saws, caked with residue that would later be confirmed as human remains. "This isn't cooking," one forensic technician muttered under his breath as he bagged yet another piece of gruesome evidence. "This is butchery." Outside, a crowd began to gather as news circulated that the sheriff's department was conducting a major investigation. Fairhaven's quiet streets buzzed as dozens of residents lined up along the curb outside the diner. The iconic neon Collins Diner Best Burgers in Town sign flickered in the overcast daylight above the bold heads of onlookers who spoke in hushed tones. Rumors became facts, and facts became warped into terrifying legends as speculation spiraled further than anyone could control. "What's happening in there? Did they find—" "They found bodies!" someone whispered harshly, though they hadn't really seen anything firsthand yet. "You think he was feeding us? Oh God!" a woman murmured, her voice trembling. Inside, Sheriff Kane stood staring into the freezer as more evidence was painstakingly gathered. Her hands trembled slightly, though she hid the unease well from her deputies. "How could we have missed this?" she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else. "Right under our noses all this time, the food, the disappearances, God help us." Jack Collins, meanwhile, stood silently by the counter as the diner he had worked in every day for years was torn apart piece by horrifying piece. He didn't speak or protest as officers catalogued his knives, his grills, his blood-stained rags. He didn't blink when they pulled the black bags from the freezer. But it was his expression, calm, detached, that unsettled everyone the most. For a man whose world was now crumbling around him, Jack seemed eerily unbothered, like he'd been expecting this moment all along. When finally asked to comment, his only words were a flat, monotonous statement. "You ate it. You all loved it." The room froze. Whether he meant it as a taunt, a confession, or something stranger altogether, nobody knew. What was certain, however, was that the evidence left no room for doubt. Jack Collins wasn't just running a diner, he was running a nightmare factory. By the end of the day, Collins had been placed under arrest, his hands shackled as deputies led him out of his diner for the last time. As he walked past the waiting crowd, his face remained as calm as ever, unflinching even as shouts rang out. "Murderer! Monster! Burn in hell, Jack!" Fairhaven would never be the same after that day. What was once a quaint, sleepy little town had now become a place haunted by the pieces of horror uncovered in that kitchen. Residents who had trusted Jack for years now questioned every burger they'd ever eaten, every cup of coffee Jack had poured with that indifferent expression of his. Details revealed from former employee testimonies. As the shocking investigation into Collins's diner unfolded, the sheriff's office turned its focus to those who had worked closest to Jack Collins over the years. Former employees who had once sliced tomatoes at the prep station or wiped down the diner's checkered tables now found themselves answering crucial questions about the man who had once been their boss. What started as straightforward accounts of life inside the diner quickly unraveled into a collection of eerie, chilling stories that painted Jack Collins in a much darker light. For years, Fairhaven had always assumed Collins's diner was like any other small-town eatery, busy during breakfast, calmer in the afternoons, bustling during Friday's dinner rush when families stopped in after community events. But according to those who had worked there, beneath the surface of its comfort food and bland white-tile kitchen was something far more bizarre. Employees who had initially been hesitant to speak out now felt uneasy secrets bubbling to the surface, secrets they might have kept buried if not for the horrifying evidence recently uncovered in Jack's freezer. The dishwasher's midnight sightings. Tommy Jensen, a teenager who worked as a dishwasher at the diner 3 summers ago, had been among the first to quit without notice. Back when the only rumors about the diner revolved around how Jack made his burgers so juicy, Tommy had brushed off his departure as simply wanting to focus on school. But the truth, as he reluctantly confessed to the sheriff's office, was much stranger. "Jack always did these late shifts," Tommy began, nervously twisting his ball cap in his hands as he sat in the cramped corner of the interrogation room. "You'd think a guy like him would close up shop and go home, you know? But no, he always stayed behind, working on God knows what in the kitchen." When the deputies pressed for more details, Tommy's face paled. "There was this one night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Long after the place was closed. I'd forgotten my wallet in the back locker and came back to grab it. I saw Jack in the kitchen. He didn't hear me come in. He was dragging this, black trash bag across the floor. It was kinda lumpy, and I swear to God, Sheriff, it was leaving this gross wet streak behind it." Tommy shook his head as if trying to push away the memory. "I asked him if he needed help, just trying to be polite, and he jumps, like real defensive, yells at me to mind my damn business. After that, I guess I knew that place wasn't right. Quit a week later, never went back." The waitress in the freezer rule, Jessica Myers, had worked as a part-time waitress the previous year, drawn to the flexible hours and the tips she could pocket during busy weekend shifts. She described Jack as fair but distant, a boss who didn't ask too many questions but made it clear he didn't want to answer any either. "Honestly, Jack was quiet, the kind of guy that just did his work and went home," she started when interviewed by Sheriff Kane's deputies. But when asked about anything unusual during her time at the diner, Jessica hesitated. Something was clearly weighing on her mind. "It was the freezer," Jessica eventually said, her voice almost trembling. "It's hard to explain, but he was really, really weird about that freezer. No one was allowed to touch it, ever. Like, I can't even tell you how many times we'd run out of patties during a dinner rush, and if I told Jack I was gonna go grab more from the freezer, he'd snap." When asked how Jack would react, she continued, "He'd drop whatever he was doing, march to the freezer himself, and come back 5 minutes later with exactly what we needed. It didn't matter if he was grilling burgers, ringing up the register, he wouldn't let anyone else near it. And if you got too curious or tried to ask why, well," Jessica bit her lip, hesitating again, "he'd give you that look, you know, the kind of look that shuts you up real fast. Something about it just told you to stop pushing." The busboy's strange encounter. Paul Harris, who had worked as a busboy at Collins's diner for nearly 6 months, shared a story that added even more unease to the growing pile of suspicion. At the time, Paul hadn't thought much of it. It was just one of those bizarre things you witness and shrug off as small-town oddity. Now with the investigation underway, it felt more sinister. "It was a Friday night and the place was packed like it always was," Paul explained. "Jack had been running around like usual, flipping burgers, checking on the fryers. Everything was normal, but after closing I noticed he didn't seem like himself." Paul described how Jack had vanished into the back kitchen for a long stretch of time, leaving him to clean up the front on his own. Normally he'd help out a little or at least hover over us to make sure we were doing things right, but that night, he was back there for like an hour, Paul recalled. When asked if he peeked into the kitchen, Paul shook his head. "No way, you don't creep up on Jack when he's back there, trust me." But when he did finally come out, he was dragging this wheeled cart out to his truck. I swear it smelled awful. Like rotting meat, but not like steak or brisket. Something worse. Paul stopped for a moment, as if debating whether to mention something else. The deputies encouraged him to continue. "But the thing is, I heard clinking, like, when you hear bones knocking together, that's what it sounded like. Don't know what was in that cart, but after what y'all found in the freezer, I think I know what it might have been." The meat delivery standoff. Perhaps the most damning account came from Roy Patterson, a driver for Henderson's Wholesale Meats who had delivered to the diner sporadically over the years. Like James Riker, another Henderson's delivery man who mysteriously vanished months earlier, Roy remembered Collins's diner all too well. "Jack was always particular about his orders," Roy began. "Too particular. Normally restaurants like his would stick to the basics. Standard cuts, packaged patties, ground beef. Not Jack. He ordered the weird stuff. Like, once he asked if I could get him scraps, odds and ends, bits nobody else wants." What struck Roy as odd wasn't just the requests, but the way Jack handled the transitions. "I'd make the delivery and he always insisted on unloading the truck himself. Wouldn't let me carry so much as one box into his kitchen. Most places they're grateful for the help, but he was paranoid. Kept saying it was a health code thing, but I've been doing this job for years, and that's not normal." The bigger picture comes together. As each testimony reached the sheriff's office, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Jack Collins wasn't simply a distant boss with strict rules, he had been cultivating an atmosphere of secrecy within his diner, steering both employees and outsiders away from areas he didn't want them to see. The trash bags, the freezer, the odd deliveries, the warning looks. Alone, each story seemed strange but perhaps explainable. Together, they painted a picture of a man who had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. Fairhaven had trusted Jack Collins for years. Most of its residents had sat in his booths, eaten his burgers, and chatted with him as he silently poured coffee. But now, as the stories of former employees came to light, that trust began to erode. What was once cozy familiarity now teetered on the edge of something terrifying. The intense, statewide manhunt. The arrest of Jack Collins and the gruesome discoveries at his diner had already shattered the fragile peace of Fairhaven. But what nobody expected, what would send the entire state of Missouri spiraling, was what happened next. Jack Collins escaped. It was a jail transfer that should have been routine. 2 deputies driving Collins in a county van from the Fairhaven lockup to a larger correctional facility over in Jefferson City. Sheriff Kane herself had arranged the process, making sure everything would go by the book. But Jack, cold and calculating as ever, had other plans. Somewhere along the long, wooded stretch of Route 83, the van came to a screeching halt. "We just needed to take a pit stop," Deputy Lambert would later explain during the chaos that followed. 5 minutes, not even. But 5 minutes was all Collins needed. By the time the 2 deputies returned from the rest area, the van was empty, the rear doors swinging lazily in the morning breeze. Jack was gone. The message spread like wildfire. The diner incident had already made state headlines, but now it grew into a full-blown media frenzy. "Suspected cannibal escapes," read the giant headlines as television stations ran breaking news updates every hour. Radio stations buzzed with directions for the community. "Lock your doors, don't walk alone at night, and report any suspicious activity." Jack Collins, the man whose calm demeanor and unnerving self-control had already terrorized Fairhaven, was now loose somewhere in Missouri. The search begins. Law enforcement deployed every resource they had. Helicopters hovered low over the dense woods surrounding Route 83, their spotlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. Bloodhounds were brought in to pick up Collins's trail, their desperate howls echoing through the trees. Checkpoints were set up along all major highways leading out of the county, and state troopers patrolled back roads with newfound urgency. Every truck stop, gas station, and diner within a 100-mile radius was inspected carefully. For Sheriff Kane, the escape was personal. This wasn't just about public safety, it was about the weight of knowing Jack was out there, slipping through her fingers. "We can't let him get away," she told her team in a late-night meeting at the station. "Every second he's out there, he's one step closer to disappearing, and God help us if he disappears." But Collins seemed to have melted into thin air. Days turned into a week with no sign of him. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, each more bizarre than the last. "I saw him camping in my neighbor's field," one caller insisted. "I swear he's hiding at the old lumber mill off County Road 12, another shouted. Deputies scrambled from one tip to the next, wearing themselves thin as every sighting turned out to be a dead end. "He's too smart for this," Kane admitted one evening. "He's not hiding out where we're looking. He's blending in. That's what he does. He'll go somewhere no one thinks twice about him. He's done it before." Statewide terror and hysteria. The manhunt spread beyond Fairhaven as the surrounding counties grew gripped by fear. Schools doubled down on security, some even sending kids home early for a week. Families reinforced their locks, and strangers walking down country roads were met with narrowed eyes and shotgun barrels if they got too close. The face of Jack Collins stared back at everyone from every newspaper and television screen. His mugshot, a neutral, almost lifeless expression, became a haunting symbol. "You could feel him everywhere, even if he wasn't there," Evelyn Saunders said, recalling those weeks in the salon. "Every time a customer came in late or the wind rattled the window just right, I'd feel my stomach drop like maybe it was him, you know? Like maybe he was watching." More missing person cases also surfaced around this time. These weren't tied to Jack Collins at first, but they added fuel to the fire. A trucker passing through Jefferson City never made it back to his route. A transient man who often slept near the train depot vanished without a trace. A waitress from a coffee shop 2 counties over left for her night shift and was never seen again. Each case was eerily similar. No witnesses, minimal evidence, and no logical explanation. Rumors spiraled further out of control. People whispered that Jack wasn't hiding at all, that he was hunting again. "This guy spent years right under our noses," an anchor on the local news said after one broadcast. "We may not see him coming until it's too late." The break in the case. It wasn't until late September, over a month after his escape, that law enforcement got their first real break. A clerk at a small general store on the outskirts of a neighboring state called in a sighting. "I swear it was him," she told dispatchers. "He didn't say much, just came in, bought some canned food and a carton of cigarettes. But I saw his face on the news after he left. I'm telling you, it's him." The sighting was enough to reignite the search. Sheriff Kane and a special task force moved across state lines with precision, narrowing their efforts to a string of small towns scattered across rolling countryside. Collins, however, was slippery. By the time law enforcement checked one lead, he was already gone. But Collins made a mistake, perhaps out of desperation. In October, another tip came in from a manager at a remote motel. A man matching Collins's description had been renting a room under a fake name. Investigators swept in with special forces before dawn, surrounding the property. The capture. It was a quiet, gray morning when they found him. Collins had shaved his head, grown a scruffy beard, and taken on a thoroughly forgettable appearance, blending into the transient population. But even under his disguise, his eerily calm demeanor hadn't changed. As police flooded the motel room, Collins didn't fight back. He didn't reach for a weapon, or make a desperate move like the officers half expected. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, staring out the window. "Figured you'd catch up eventually," he said flatly, his voice unchanged from the tone he used while handing out burgers years ago. He was immediately cuffed and escorted to a secure transport van, this time under the watch of armed federal marshals instead of small-town deputies. Aftermath of the chase. The relief in Fairhaven was palpable the moment the town got word of Collins' capture. Front lawns that had remained dark for weeks suddenly buzzed with porch lights again. People returned to Main Street with a cautious optimism. However, the scars left by the search and Collins himself were far from healed. "He was one of us," a local said during a news interview. "Even if we don't want to admit it, he lived with us, walked these streets. And the fact that he got loose? That stayed with us. It changed how we see this town forever." Even as the town tried to move on, the police logs remained full. Nearly every day, Sheriff Kane's team received a new anonymous tip, someone claiming to have seen that Jack guy lurking near their property or passing through a rest stop. The real Jack Collins was in custody by then, but to the residents of Fairhaven, his shadow loomed far larger than the man himself. The sensational trial and severe verdict. The trial of Jack Collins was not just a courtroom proceeding, it was a spectacle. It was the kind of case that gripped the nation, stoked tabloid headlines, and turned the sleepy town of Fairhaven into the epicenter of one of the most chilling legal proceedings in modern American history. For weeks, the words Collins Diner were no longer associated with burgers and greasy fries, but with grisly crimes that defied comprehension. The world outside of Fairhaven had quickly latched onto the case, feeding a media frenzy that followed Collins's every move from the moment of his capture to his eventual arrival at the courthouse. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse day and night, cameras flashing, while TV vans crowded the streets in what seemed like an endless procession. Every major news network ran some variation of the same headline: "The Butcher of Fairhaven faces justice." A packed courtroom. The courtroom was packed for the proceedings. Journalists with notepads, townsfolk clutching their rosaries, and silent family members of the victims who sat in somber rows, staring holes through the back of Collins's head. Jack Collins himself sat at the defense table, shackled, wearing the standard-issue orange jumpsuit. If he felt any remorse, it didn't show. His face was as blank and unreadable as the day he was arrested. Sheriff Diana Kane, a key witness for the prosecution, sat near the front, her jaw set tight. She had promised herself this would end here, in this room, with the justice that Fairhaven desperately needed. Every time a gavel banged or an attorney raised their voice, her pulse quickened. She wasn't just watching a trial, she was watching years of trust, community, and innocence being stripped away piece by piece. The prosecution builds the case. The evidence against Jack Collins was overwhelming. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of the man who had been trusted to serve burgers on Main Street. They laid out the findings from the search of the diner: the human remains stuffed into freezer bags, the streaks of blood on the kitchen floor tiles, the bone saws disguised as kitchen tools. Assistant District Attorney Carla Rhodes delivered a blistering opening statement that left the courtroom breathless. She didn't mince words. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Jack Collins didn't just murder his victims, he treated them as commodities. He desecrated their bodies, hid them in plain sight, and even, by his own admission, processed their remains within the walls of his diner." Fairhaven isn't just mourning lives lost, we're mourning a sense of safety and trust that this man took from every one of us. The jury sat motionless as the prosecution began parading witness after witness to the stand. Forensic specialists described in excruciating detail how they identified the remains of at least 7 individuals recovered from Collins's freezer. The chilling testimony laid bare the full extent of Collins's crimes, the way he methodically dismembered his victims to make them unrecognizable. The tissue samples linked directly to missing persons in Fairhaven. The DNA splatters found embedded in the crevices of his diner's machinery. "It wasn't just murder," one forensic expert said bluntly. "It was an operation. He didn't act on impulse, this was cold, calculated logistics." Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from the families of the victims. Amy Greer's parents, clutching photographs of their daughter, sobbed openly as they described the day she disappeared without a trace. James Riker's younger brother, his cheeks streaked with tears, spoke of how his family waited months for answers that came in the form of Jack Collins' horrifying confession. The defense attempts the impossible. Collins' defense team knew they were climbing a legal cliff face with no safety net. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you create doubt when the evidence is staring the jury in the face? Their argument, which wavered between desperation and absurdity, relied heavily on Collins's demeanor. His lead attorney, Greg Waller, tried to paint him as a misunderstood loner, disconnected from reality. "My client may struggle with social norms," Waller told the jury, "but that doesn't mean he's guilty of the atrocities he's being accused of." At one point, the defense hinted at the possibility of mental illness, a plea that Collins himself seemed uninterested in supporting. He refused psychological evaluations, glaring at psychiatrists as though they were beneath him. He was cold, uncooperative, and distant, refusing to explain his actions or even acknowledge the depth of his crimes. But what truly sealed the defense's failure was Collins's own words. When the prosecution played a recording of his arrest where he muttered, "You ate it, you all loved it," the courtroom erupted. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by audible sobs from the victims' families. If there had been any chance of mercy from the jury, it evaporated in that moment. Jack Collins speaks. In what came as a shocking move, Collins took the stand during the last days of the trial. Everyone in the room, from the jury to the reporters in the gallery, braced for fireworks. What Jack gave them was far worse than they could have imagined. He didn't deny the murders. In a calm, almost chilling tone, he described how he chose his victims, how he watched for people who wouldn't be missed, how he preyed on the vulnerable, and how he carefully covered his tracks for years. His confession wasn't one of guilt or remorse. It was clinical, matter of fact. When the prosecutor pressed him, asking why he had done it, Collins simply tilted his head. "Because I could," he said, "because no one noticed." The words hung in the air like a dark storm cloud, suffocating the courtroom. Even his own defense attorney seemed stunned into silence, his attempt at a diminished mental capacity argument reduced to ashes. The verdict and sentencing. It took the jury less than 3 hours to deliberate. The verdict: guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. When the judge read out Collins's sentence, death by lethal injection, it was met with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. After months of agony, the victims' families wept quietly, clutching one another for support. Sheriff Kane let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything this trial had meant for the town, the victims, and herself. "This isn't about vengeance," the judge declared solemnly as he closed the proceedings. "This sentence is about justice, for the lives you took, for the trust you destroyed, and for the terror you sowed in a community that deserved far better." The aftermath of the trial. Collins showed no emotion as he was escorted out of the courtroom, his face as blank as it had ever been. As news of the verdict spread, townsfolk in Fairhaven held quiet gatherings to reflect, to grieve, and perhaps to begin healing. Candles were lit outside the remains of Collins' Diner, the once vibrant corner restaurant now roped off with yellow tape and destined for demolition. The story, of course, didn't end there. For years to come, the trial of Jack Collins would be dissected on true crime podcasts, television specials, and books written by eager journalists hungry for the details. But for Fairhaven, the wounds went far deeper than the headlines. It was never about the food, Evelyn Saunders would later say during an interview at her beauty salon. It was about trust. We trusted him. We let him into our lives, our kids' lives, and look what he did. How do you come back from that? For Sheriff Kane and the people of Fairhaven, the scars left behind by Jack Collins would never fully heal. The trial may have ended, justice may have been served, but the memories lingered, a constant reminder that monsters don't always look like strangers. Sometimes they're the ones serving your coffee and asking if you'd like fries with that. The haunting legacy. Long after the trial ended, long after Jack Collins was sentenced to death and executed in 1997, the people of Fairhaven were left with something far more enduring than justice. They were left with the shadow he cast, the questions his actions ignited, and the scars that refused to fade. Collins's Diner, once the heart of the town, had become a chilling symbol of deception. For years, it had been a place of comfort, a greasy spoon where you could get your morning coffee or indulge in a burger that locals swore was the best in the county. Now, it was nothing more than a painful reminder of the horrors that had brewed behind its unassuming walls. The diner itself was torn down a year after Collins was executed. Yellow police tape had clung to it for months as investigators, forensic scientists, and construction crews moved in and out. When the demolition crews finally came to knock it down, it was like the entire town held its breath. The building didn't just fall like bricks and mortar, it crumbled under the weight of what it had come to symbolize: betrayal, fear, and something darker than anyone in Fairhaven had been prepared to face. Ghosts of a shattered town. Fairhaven was not the same town it used to be. The charm of its rolling Missouri hills, the pastel-painted storefronts of Main Street, and the chorus of kids playing baseball in loud, carefree voices, all of it felt muted now. The burden of Jack Collins' crimes weighed heavily on the shoulders of every citizen, from the elderly women who shuffled into church on Sunday mornings to the teenagers who found themselves riding their bikes a little faster when passing too close to the diner's now empty lot. "It's not just what he did," Evelyn Saunders, the town's resident hairstylist, explained in an interview years later. "It's how he fooled all of us. We let him in, we trusted him. All those Friday nights eating at his diner, talking with him like he was just another neighbor, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about people. The trust in the town, the sense of safety that small communities like Fairhaven cling to, had been shattered. Neighbors no longer left their doors unlocked at night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them roam the sidewalks alone. Even the familiar stranger, the kind of kindly outsider you might have invited to a barbecue or welcomed into a church potluck, was now met with a wary glance. "I don't know if we'll ever go back to normal," Mayor Jim Hartford admitted in an interview not long after Collins' sentencing. "Maybe normal was just an illusion all along. Maybe we never really knew what people were capable of. And maybe now, we do." The families left behind. The families of Jack Collins' victims carried a burden even heavier than most. For them, it wasn't just about broken trust or personal betrayal, it was about unspeakable loss. Amy Greer's parents still lived in the same small house they had owned for nearly 30 years. Her bedroom, untouched since the day she went missing, became a shrine to the young woman they had loved so deeply and lost so tragically. Her mother, Susan, couldn't bear to throw away the little things Amy had left behind: the half-filled bottle of lavender perfume on the dresser, the stack of college brochures she had been so excitedly collecting. "I think about what happened to her every single day," Susan said quietly during a televised special on the case. "Not just because she's gone, but because I trusted that man. I let her work at his diner. I sent her there every day knowing she'd be safe. And look at what happened." James Riker's younger brother, still grieving the loss of his sibling years later, summed it up plainly. "It's not just that he took my brother," he said during the same special, his voice trembling. "It's that he lied, he looked us in the eye, he made us think he was just another guy, another neighbor, and the whole time he was hiding that." For these families, closure was a cruel concept. Yes, Jack Collins was convicted. Yes, he paid for his crimes. But the empty chairs at Christmas dinner, the framed photographs gathering dust on the mantel, the birthdays that passed without celebration, those were wounds no court, no sentencing could ever heal. A town haunted by memory. Even the physical reminders of Jack Collins were nearly impossible to escape. The empty lot where the diner once stood became a kind of eerie landmark, a place so many people avoided that even the weeds seemed afraid to grow there. Children dared each other to step onto the property, their bravery fueled more by nervous giggles than actual courage. Local teens whispered about ghosts that supposedly haunted the site, their hushed stories creating the kind of folklore that small towns inevitably build around their tragedies. "I heard one kid say they saw a face in the windows of their car when they drove by," Evelyn recalled with a sad smirk. "Can't blame them for their imaginations. Lord knows we've all imagined worse." But it wasn't just the kids who felt it. Adults too had a hard time putting the past to rest. Sunday breakfasts at other restaurants never quite had the same cheer, the same light-hearted chatter, because even those meals held a kind of shadow now. People whispered under their breath when the plates arrived, wondering, no matter how irrational it seemed, if they could still trust what was being served. "It's stupid, I know," one woman admitted to Sheriff Kane in the supermarket months after the trial. "But every time I eat a burger now, I think about him. I think about that freezer." Sheriff Kane, for her part, never stopped feeling the weight of what had happened. Even years after Collins was gone, she would wake in the middle of the night thinking about the case, replaying moments in her head like a film she was doomed to watch on repeat. The evidence, the testimonies, the horrifying words Collins had said during the trial. Sometimes in the stillness of her home, she felt like she could still smell the metallic tang of blood that had clung to the air inside that diner's kitchen. A legacy that refused to die true. Crime enthusiasts and media outlets made Jack Collins infamous, and in doing so ensured that Fairhaven's wounds would never fully heal. Documentaries, podcasts, and even cheaply written books lunged at every gruesome detail, broadcasting the town's pain to the world. Some residents refused to engage with it, burying themselves in their work, their families, their routines, but the reminders were always there, lurking on the fringes of every conversation, every mention of what Fairhaven used to be. "I wish they'd stop making shows about him," Mayor Hartford once said during a Fox News segment. "We don't need 100 more people coming through town to point at where it happened or to take selfies at the old lot. What we need is peace, but the media won't let us have it. The truth never goes away." Years later, as the dust began to settle and Collins's crimes took their place in history books, Fairhaven tried its best to move forward. The town gathered for 4th of July parades again, the high school football team brought home championship trophies, and new families moved into the neighborhoods, carrying no memories of what had happened. But for those who had lived through it, the reminders never stopped. "It's not something you just forget," said Evelyn, shaking her head in an interview years later. "You carry it with you like a bad scar. You try to live, you try to laugh again, but it's there, no matter how hard you try to cover it up." Fairhaven still stood as it always had, but there was a chill in the air now, a mistrust that wasn't there before. The legacy of Jack Collins wasn't just the lives he had taken, it was the town he had changed forever.